This is very long and starts what has been a lifelong encounter from my boyfriend. This goes over any of the context needed for the more recent sightings over the past 2 years, which are somehow even scarier. Since this is his story, I'm waiting for him to finish it up. He's interested in sharing this story, as am I, but he's not as good at using this as I am and keeping up with social media, so I'm sharing it with you guys. This is in northern Indiana, for anyone who is interested. Think rural South Bend, 30 minutes out from the city. Looking back, the signs were almost always there. Back when I was in elementary school, the entryway to our basement was walled off and had a door, which has since been torn down to make the room more open, leaving the opening to the basement to a staircase surrounded by a banister in the center of the room. On occasion, the air caught behind the basement door would have a very strange and distinct smell. It wasn't molded or rotten or anything like that, but it was just some odd smell that I've never smelt before or after. Instead of coming across a strange combination of slight fish, fruit, and dirt, my mom found the smell disgusting. I found it strangely comforting. My dad made no comment, and my sister claimed to not even notice it. In any case, the smell stopped appearing after the walls and door of the staircase were removed, perhaps allowing the airflow more readily and not to allow the scent to build up. I distinctly remember a strange occurrence that I had originally written off as nothing until the more evident encounters began years later. I was late into elementary school, about 5th or 6th grade. We owned a cheap hard plastic drinking cups that everyone in the house used on a regular basis, usually leaving them out on the kitchen island for reuse. One night, as I was trying to fall asleep, I heard the very distinct plastic clunk drag noise from one of the cups on the table being nonchalantly placed back down on the table. At first, I assumed it was another family member getting a late night drink, but after no one walked past my door to return to bed, all of our bedroom doors were at the end of one single hallway, and I was the first, I became nervous. Apparently, my mother felt the same way because a few seconds later she asked from her bed, "Was that either of you kids?" My dad was asleep next to her, and both my sister and I responded in the negative. We all quietly shrugged it off and tried to return to sleep. At some point in middle school, my longtime friend Nadia was relaying a story of the adventures she had experienced with her friends. Nadia lived down the street and around the corner from my house, about a half-mile from my home. We always counted ourselves as neighbors despite the distance, rural Indiana being what it is. Between our homes is a decent-sized woodland, owned by a man who I have never met and only heard referred to as George, though I know for a fact that is not his real name. George's house is located in the center of the woods, though there are some gaps in the trees where you can glimpse his run-down outbuildings and barns from across the fields in my backyard when the corn doesn't block your line of sight. It is a common joke or rumor among Nadia and her friends, as well as the other kids living on the block, to refer to George as the cannibal, due to his reclusive nature and creepy property. Nadia and a few of her friends had, at one point, decided to sneak through the woods to get a better look at the house and whatever was going on there. However, mere yards into the forest, they encountered a crisscrossing network of tripwires that appeared to be connected to various chimes and bells. Upon coming across this primitive alarm system, they promptly chickened out and abandoned their quest. After hearing this story, I kept an eye on George's woods whenever I walked past and confirmed that there was indeed an array of wires and chimes that could be spotted through the patches in the trees. These alarms are still in place, of the very recent past anyway. At that time, this was just something spooky that happened. In retrospect, we wonder if those were in place to keep something other than people out. It's worth mentioning that the woods near his house are some of the last woods in the area, as the rest are now cornfields. There was always a patch of ground on our property near the edge of our woods that I always felt was strange. It was a perfect circle of grass that refused to grow taller than 1 inch, no matter how long it would be and how long we would go without mowing it. It was natural, live grass and always soft to the touch. I was always curious about what it was, but had a very strong instinctual urge to, under no circumstances, dig up whatever was under that round patch. Another ground-related incident occurred right before the encounters began in full swing. In the spring of 2013, the end of my junior year of high school, we noticed through the gap in the trees that George had procured a large backhoe and over the course of a month had created a very large pit, if the pile of dirt was anything to judge by. Nadia and I joked that this was a mass grave for the gnawed-on remains of the cannibal's victims. I still have no idea what purpose the thing has, but you can still see the huge pile of dirt at the edge of the hole from the backyard. Based on the timing of what happened next, I have a strong feeling the digging of that hole had something to do with the uptick in activity at my house and the surrounding area. Summer of 2013, when things began in earnest. I was a bored, lonely, and unemployed teenager with nothing much to do. As such, I spent a great deal of my time going on walks up and down the country roads and down my block. My normal route was a left out of my driveway, a long jaunt to the end of my road, a right turn, and then another jaunt to the creatively named Mile Tree, located exactly 1 mile away from my house. Shocking. I would then turn around and return home to waste more time. Around late June, pavement that had washed out a few winters before, about 2010 or 2011, it had been shoddily repaired. A lump of asphalt and concrete chunks that created a hump of road traversing the sunken depression of a swamp that had caused it to collapse in the first place. This swampy depression was in turn surrounded by more of the ever-present cornfields. It came on very suddenly. One day, things were normal, and the next day they were not. Without fail, every time I reached that wrecked section of the road, everything would go silent and there would be no sign of wildlife. No birds. Nothing. There were no frogs in the mud and no buzzing of insects. There was a sickeningly intense feeling of being watched. Occasionally, there would be soft sounds of something moving through the cornfields on the south side of the road, then accompanied by an odd metallic scraping noise. My road ends in a gentle hill about 500 yards past the wet depression. Walking towards the hill, nothing seemed out of place, but on your way back home, if you looked back at the slope, there would be a very distinct dark shadow cast halfway up the hill. A nondescript circle shape, like those drawn under a character by a lazy animator. I was not the only one to notice these things. Any friend I took with me on the walk down that route would always point out the same things. The eerie silence, the feeling of watching eyes, and the inexplicable dark shape on the hill. I would never point out any details or hint that something was off, curious as to whether it was all in my head or not, but without fail, they all saw the same things around us every single time. Things only picked up from there. On the return trip of one of my walks, I noticed a baby bird dead in the middle of the road. It was underdeveloped, eyes closed, and bearing no feathers whatsoever. Far too small to have tried to fly from the nest and ended up there by itself. I wrote it off as being hauled there by a cat or a coyote and moved on. But after about 30 feet walking ahead, I happened across another, small and naked with bulging closed eyes. In another 30 feet, I oddly found another. I hadn't noticed these birds before, only on my return trip. I consider myself a very observant person, and dead birds have always been somewhat of a bad omen in my eyes. So I was surprised that I hadn't seen them earlier. I grew more suspicious as I continued home. Like every 30 feet or so, there was another dead bird, too young to have gotten there on its own. This trail of birds continued all the way back to my house and up my driveway, ending on the concrete approach in front of my garage. Neither of our cats nor dogs, both famous for eating any dead thing they could get their paws on, would approach the rotting little things. After the trail of birds, my walk got considerably less eerie. The muddy section of the road was back to its noisy self, and I no longer felt watching eyes or heard something stalking through the cornfields. This is because, unfortunately, those sensations had migrated to our woods. I tried my absolute best not to let feelings get to me, spending no less time outdoors, but it was always there in the back of my mind. Some night in early July, a motorist killed a deer in front of our house. the impact flinging the thing into the tall grass on the edge of our forest bordering the road. It was far enough out of sight and out of mind that we didn't bother moving the animal. It lay there concealed by the grass for about a day. After that, the carcass was gone, replaced with heavy drag marks and flattened grass heading into the woods. Assuming coyotes had decided to take themselves a meal, and being the macabre little shit that I am, I gave in to curiosity and followed the trail into the woods. About 15 yards in, I found the ruined remains of the back half of a deer, mostly devoured. A few feet away was the front half of the animal hanging by its front legs and chin from a tree. A good 5 feet of clearance between its shredded midsection and the ground below. I'm unaware of any breed of coyote that leaves that much of a meal for later and hangs their prize up in a tree beyond their reach. There were also no reports of any large cats or other predators capable of moving a full-size deer carcass up a tree trunk in the area. In any case, I decided it was time to move along and go back inside. The first face-to-face encounter occurred just a few days after. My dad returned from work and presented me with a machete that he had bought to clear brush to do yard work. It was cheap and dull. It was a machete that I, as a high school kid, would be able to use safely. I decided to take the thing for a spin and headed out on the trail through the woods, hacking at the weeds and vines of the side of the trail. As I continued further down the path, feeling of being watched returned in force, worse than it ever had before. It was enough to make my chest tighten and the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I reached the point in the trail that enters a small pine grove, dark and quiet, even in the middle of the day. Stretched across the entrance to the grove was a large spider web at about head and chest height. Deciding to respect the spider's home was good enough excuse to get out of there, and I promptly turned around and left. But I was bored and dumb, and the other portions of the trail didn't have any weeds and they were satisfying to chop, so eventually I decided I would just go back and duck under the web despite the feelings of primal terror emanating from that part of the woods. As it turned out, I didn't need to duck it at all. When I got to the entrance of the pine trees, the spiderweb was broken in half right down the middle, dangling on the side of the trail. Whatever walked through the web would have been at least as tall as I was, considering the web had been face level with me. I stepped through into the dark and quickly made my way through the light on the other side, where the periphery of the woods and the pavement of the road waited. Though my arms felt weak and my instincts were on overdrive, I decided to turn to the side of the path and chop down one last vine before calling it quits. I turned to the side of the path, and through the corner of my eye, I saw it. I snapped my head to the side to look right at the thing. It appeared that we were both stunned, me at having seen it, and it had been spotted. It was standing shock still in the center of the path about 20 feet behind me. It was tall, or at least a little taller than me, probably 6 feet tops. It was extremely scrawny and stood naked, though I saw no evidence of a genitalia. The skin was dirty pale. Its face was a mask of skin stretched over sunken eye sockets and had an open mouth. Not unlike the features of someone wearing a morph suit though, with the anatomy more defined. After a few seconds of stunned silence, we both snapped out of our shock, with me making a break for the road and the thing crashing through the underbrush heading deeper into the woods. I was almost convinced that the whole thing was some vivid hallucination, but that hope quickly ended as I realized I'm not the only one to have seen the thing. I could also hear it breaking its way through the brush and twigs heading away from me into the forest. I was understandably pretty shaken up by the whole encounter, but I tried to shake it off, mostly for the sake of denial. I didn't bring it up with anyone else in the family, fully expecting that they wouldn't believe me anyway. Later that night, I went to bed. The floor of my room was strewn with various sheets of paper and drawings. In the middle of the night, I woke up with a sinking feeling in my gut. I laid there facing the wall, not daring to roll over. There was the very distinct noise of someone stepping on the sheets of paper on the ground. I'm not sure how long I was stuck there, but eventually, I had drifted back into sleep, likely due to exhaustion. The next morning when I checked the ground of papers, the floor was crumpled and appeared to be trodden on.